This episode offers psychosocial education designed to inspire and motivate our listeners. The information provided does not constitute a therapeutic relationship nor a substitute for professional mental health care. If you are experiencing a mental health crisis, call 911, go to your nearest emergency room, or for listeners in the United States, text 988 for the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Warning, this episode contains brain food that will lead to improved emotional and social intelligence. Thanks for tuning in to Harvesting Happiness today for a healthy serving of consciously prepared brain food. This is Lisa Cypers Kamen, your host. Since 2010, we've been broadcasting sound ideas for better well-being. Each week, we spotlight diverse thinkers and doers who are contemporary trendsetters and change agents, devoting their lives to creating a better world. I invite you to listen and change how you think about human happiness. Our award-winning content is fresh, optimistic, and purpose-driven media that promotes well-being from the inside out. This episode is part of the Good Citizens Election Season Survival Guide to Restoring Common Sense and Sanity in a Crazy World, produced in collaboration with renowned, fair-minded subject matter experts who provide strategies that enhance critical thinking, increase civic engagement, and foster healthy pleasure to boost personal well-being and relationship satisfaction. You can also discover more unique bonus content at More Mental Fitness by Harvesting Happiness on Substack and Medium. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining me on today's show, where you will learn about the psychology of political groupthink, cognitive bias, belief, and Infowar. My guest is Professor Stephan Lewandowsky, who is a cognitive scientist at the University of Bristol in the UK. His research focuses on human memory, decision-making, and how misinformation affects public beliefs and behaviors. Stephan's work primarily explores how false information spreads, why people believe in conspiracy theories, and how to debunk misinformation effectively. Professor Lewandowsky has published hundreds of scholarly articles, chapters, and books, and is often cited for his subject matter expertise. His research regularly appears in journals such as Nature Human Behavior, Nature Communications, and Psychological Review. Welcome, Professor Lewandowsky.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, this is a juicy topic, and many of us, which is why we've all come together to really work so hard on this series, are concerned about the coming years, the elections that are coming up around the world, and the tensions that are causing a rift in our society. Let's talk a little bit about what happens, how technology influences democracy.
Well, that's a big question, and there's lots of aspects to the answer. But let me give you just one example. And that example is based on the fact that if you go on Facebook, you will find a community that shares your belief, however absurd it is. Why? Well, because there are 5 billion people or whatever on Facebook. And so even a tiny minority can hook up. Let me illustrate it with an example. 200 years ago, if you had been the proverbial village idiot in Gloucestershire here in the UK, and you thought the earth was flat, well, no one would have listened to you. Everybody would have dismissed you. You would have never found anybody else in your life who shared that belief. And hence, you probably weren't articulating it very loudly. Now, today, you jump on Facebook with the same belief, and all of a sudden, there's a community, and you can get reinforced in your false belief. And you can say, everybody else is wrong because my friends and I all agree that the earth is flat. And the moment you have that sort of community support and the false perception of a consensus, your opinion becomes entrenched, and it becomes very difficult to update, and it becomes very difficult for you to revise your belief. And that is a unique consequence, I would argue, of the architecture of social media. And so what it does is to connect people, which is a wonderful thing. But in so doing, it is also creating communities that are impenetrable and impervious to evidence about the world. And that, I think, is a consequence we haven't quite come to terms with.
I think this is interesting because it defines or describes a little bit the sort of proverbial they. They say, who is the they?
Indeed.
Who is the they that is
Yes.
after us, or the they that is saying this? It's in that bubble.
Precisely. And that, of course, is the bigger issue. Are there filter bubbles on social media? And I think undoubtedly the answer is yes. There are segregated communities. In part, the segregation arises from algorithms that are feeding us our information, but in part it also arises from people's choice. We like being with people who are like us. It's great to be confirmed in your opinion. It's slightly less comfortable to be confronted with people who hold different opinions. So it's a very natural sort of selection process to that we aggregate into these different communities.
And talk a little bit more deeply about how it undermines the democratic process, because from what I hear you say, it splinters us off into all of these little fringe groups where we lose track, or our eyes are no longer on the collective prize of a free society.
Exactly. And that's precisely the problem. Democracy to function relies on a common knowledge base. We have to, as citizens, we have to agree on certain things before we can even disagree. Right. I mean, we may disagree about the policies regarding, unemployment or health insurance or whatever, but we can only have that disagreement if we at least acknowledge there is such thing as employment and there is such thing as health insurance. But if you have people who say, oh, no, the economy is a hoax, or, health insurance doesn't exist, and let me tell you, you may think that's absurd, but these people do exist. The moment you come to that sort of lack of sharing of just, fundamental facts about life, that is when democracy becomes problematic. And it becomes even more problematic when basic things like elections are being disputed on the basis of disinformation and inaccurate information and lies. That's when it becomes seriously problematic.
Well, it's when the lies become alternative facts.
Yes,
to quote
precisely
someone who shall remain nameless.
Oh, yes, we can we can pretend to let them remain nameless, but of course we all know who it was and who we're talking about. But you're absolutely right. That is precisely the issue. And so one of the questions that my research has tried to address is, well, how can this be the case? How can alternative facts become, how can they gain currency? And I think one of the answers is that if we look at the architecture of truth or the architecture of honesty, then it turns out that at a very deep level, there are different components of honesty. So, for example, if I honestly tell you the earth is round, then, I told you something that's true. Hence, I'm honest. But here's the thing. If I honestly tell you how I feel about the world, and I sincerely express to you my belief that the earth is flat, well, I'm also kind of honest in a sense, because I didn't lie to you. I told you what my feelings are, And so all of a sudden, we have to recognize that there are these two components of accuracy, of honesty, and of truth. One based on evidence and the other one based on authentic expression of belief.
Right.
So, and that is, I think, where the problem lies. And we have a paper actually coming out on Monday to show that these two components exist in the political speech among American politicians. And we call one aspect belief speaking and the other aspect fact speaking. And they are distinct aspects of honesty. And it turns out that among Republicans, at least, the more they engage in belief speaking, the more likely they are to accompany that belief speaking with inaccurate information.
This is very interesting because it gets into the psychology of belief,
Indeed.
right?
Indeed.
And when we talk about psychology in the traditional sense, not as it ties to politics, when we talk about how we are wired, right? What we think and what we feel are disconnected from fact often. They're not the same thing.
Indeed, they can be. They can be, and if you look at the data, one of the fascinating things about recent American politics is that while Donald Trump was president, according to fact checkers, he made something like 30,000 false or misleading claims. Right.
Yes.
Now, that's kind of like a staggering number, if you think about it, and unprecedented in the history of liberal democracies. By the same token, at the same time, 3/4 of Republicans considered him to be honest. And that, to me, is a striking paradox. How can that be that somebody who is so inaccurate and says so many things that are clearly false, that are just absurdly false, right? How can he be considered honest? And I think this idea that part of honesty is not about the world, but about whether the person is authentic and expressing their belief. The recognition that that is a component of honesty, I think, explains why demagogues such as Donald Trump, but also, here in the UK, we've had another dude with a hairdo that wasn't, they all have hairdos. I don't know what it is about it, but he had an equally estranged relationship to the truth, but didn't pay a price for that. People loved him, for a while. And we have the same in, Brazil. We have populist leaders around the world that are lying, let's face it, but people think they're honest. And I think the key is in this sort of remapping of honesty from accuracy to sincerity.
Let's take a pause. And when we come back, we will continue the conversation with my guest today, Professor Stephan Lewandowsky. We're talking about the architecture of truth, facts, fiction, and the technology trap. To learn more about Stephan's work, please go to, I'm going to spell it out because it's a tricky one, COGSCIWA.com. Once again, that's COGSCIWA.com. And you can find Stephan on Twitter at STWorg, WORG. We'll be right back. Harvesting Happiness is rooted in science. Our work facilitates applied positive psychology practices through media and consulting. We're committed to sound ideas for better well-being, leading to increased life satisfaction and a better world for everyone. We're not into pseudoscience or quick fixes. We're focused on common sense backed by rigorous research. Healthy critical thinking is the foundation for our discussions. We encourage you to challenge preconceptions and explore ideas with a curiously discerning mind. Collaboration with our guests is united by an inclusive vision to boost resilience, critical thinking, communication, and problem solving through civilized discourse and pleasurable relational engagement for everyone. Each day, we have the intellectual freedom to be happy or the liberty to be miserable, regardless of external circumstances. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, please seek support because good psychological health is vital to the achievement of a healthy and satisfying life. Visit harvestinghappiness.com for psychosocial and educational services that boost emotional and social intelligence. And we're back, continuing the conversation with Professor Stephan Lewandowsky. We're talking about the psychology of political groupthink, cognitive bias, belief, and Infowar. Let's get back to it. So, Stephan, we were talking about politics around the world and the impact of belief as it is inserted into the political conversation and how that's able to win the hearts and minds of people and how dangerous it is, actually.
Well, first of all, I have to say that, belief is indispensable in politics. And, we all engage in belief speaking when we talk about politics. You have your own opinions or beliefs about what might be the best medical care or the best legislation to support, social media for democracy or whatever. There is a lot of belief in politics, and so it should be. So the problem isn't the expression of belief per se. The problem arises when expressing a belief takes precedence over the evidence showing it to be false. That is, I think, the problem. So if I express the belief that the Earth is flat, maybe that's a silly thing to do, but nonetheless, I can do that.
There are plenty of them out there.
Well, yeah, a certain number, indeed. But the problem really arises if I'm then being confronted with the evidence that without any doubt establishes the Earth to be round, and I persist in my belief and I take my belief ahead of the evidence. That is when you run into a problem in politics. That, I think, is when democracy is crumbling, because if you claim, to pick a not so hypothetical example, the election was stolen from me, even though there's zero evidence for that. And on the contrary, tons of evidence against that proposition. If you then continue to make that claim, that is when things become problematic.
Well, I think also the issue becomes the media, right? The layer between fact and fiction, and how the media constructs or reconstructs the truth because it's serving its purpose, which is to sell advertising.
Well, yes, and we had some recent very interesting examples of various different ways in which the media do that. I'm now thinking of Fox News that, a few months ago paid out a $750 million and to settle a lawsuit against it by a voting machine manufacturer. And the reason they did it is because during discovery, it became apparent that they internally knew full well that there was nothing to this nonsense about the election being stolen. But to make money, they pretended that there was evidence, and they were building up and supporting this conspiracy theory. Ultimately led to a violent insurrection on January 6th. So this is not trivial stuff. This is really important. And in this particular instance, we have one media organization that just simply lied about it to make money. Yes. And, that's pretty concerning. But it doesn't even have to be that extreme. There are other ways in which the media can create a problem. And that is if they insist on balance and symmetry when there is none. Now, Journalism 101 teaches people you got to present both sides of the story and the readers make up their mind. Great. That's fine if there are two competing opinions that are equally supported by evidence, which can happen very easily. But that breaks down and becomes very damaging when there's a clear asymmetry where one side has all the evidence and the other side is for political reasons trying to deny that. I'm now thinking, for example, of climate change, where the scientific position is utterly clear and unambiguous and undisputed, and that is that there is climate change and it's driven by human carbon emissions, and the other side is just paid propaganda for the most part, but nothing else. And then we get to vaccinations, where we have a similar conflict between the science on the one hand and people who are opposed to vaccinations and invent falsehoods, quite frankly, on the other. And that's where the media have great difficulty identifying those situations and differentiating them from others where the balance is actually appropriate.
I want to ask what we as citizens can do. I mean, when we're talking about cognitive immunity, right? We're talking about, or the mental immunity project, right? Critical thinking and trying to think smarter, better, and more reasonably.
Yes.
How do we know? How do we trust the sources that are out there? Give us some tips for sussing this out.
Absolutely. Great question. And the $1 million question that we all have to be concerned with in how we consume news media. First of all, you can look at the argumentation of the people involved in a debate. So, for example, we've known for 2,000 years, going back to some old Greek dudes, that if you're incoherent in your argument, that then you're wrong. Okay? You cannot be incoherent and be right. It's as simple as that. It's a necessary requirement to be truthful, is that you have a coherent story that doesn't contradict itself. Well, if you know that, then you can analyze what people say. And if they contradict themselves, then you might say, whoa, what's going on here? Let me give you one example from climate denial. This is just one of hundreds of examples of incoherent speech. There's one myth that is going around out there among climate deniers that, you can't measure global temperature because thermometers are not reliable enough. Okay. Well,
I actually had not heard that one. That's a good new one.
Oh, no. Oh, it's out there. Believe me. They're claiming that the thermometers are just, hopeless and they're being measured at the wrong time of day or whatever. Some complete clownish sort of argument. But that's only half the story, because the same people will then tell you, oh, you shouldn't worry about climate change because it's been cooling for the last 5 years. Excuse me? How do you know it's been cooling if you can't measure temperature, right? It's completely incoherent. Yes. You can either say the thermometers don't work, or you can rely on the thermometers to tell you it's cooling. If you say both, then you got a serious problem. And so that sort of detecting that incoherence is a very good way of finding out whether somebody is likely to be reliable. And we've actually run experiments where we teach people in brief videos to detect incoherence. And we can do that successfully. And once they've learned to pick out incoherence, people can apply that skill and detect incoherence, which is the first step towards being resilient against being misinformed.
I like what you said about coherence. I also like what you said about the willingness to debate. And in the US, you have political candidates who are saying, Trump, for example, I don't need to debate because the people already know who I am. Well, this was a recent comment.
Oh, I mean, he's right. I think Americans do know who he is. That doesn't mean they know him in the same way. I think he obviously is a very polarizing figure.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, that is a convenient way to sidestep accountability, of course.
And the data, right? For those of us who are fact-driven and data-driven people who like to see proof of concept before making a decision, a figure like that who is not willing to come to the table with the data and the facts, I'm skeptical of, regardless of what party they are a part of. It doesn't matter.
Absolutely. And so you should be, of course. But unfortunately, it's a little more complicated because pseudoscientists pretend that they have data and that they have findings. Let's again go to climate denial. The guy who tells you that it's been cooling for 5 years, he will insist on that being true and data, and he'll say, oh, you see, the climate scientists are all ideologues because they're not agreeing with me that it's been cooling for 5 years. So then it becomes complicated. How do you tell the difference there? And the answer is again something that we can teach people, and that is that a lot of pseudoscience relies on cherry picking. That is, they don't look at all the data. They only pick the data that support what they want to say. So in the case of the guy telling you the world is cooling, well, actually, if you have a look at the data they show you, very often it's just data from the United States. Well, that's nice, except that's not global. So it tells you nothing about global warming. Or they only talk about 3 years, a ridiculously short time span, because climate change, climate is anything beyond 15 to 30 years. Anything less than that is weather. So,
interesting.
you need to know these things, and then you can analyze how well people are actually supporting their argument with data.
We're nearly out of time, and I would love to close out this episode before we invite our listeners to come on over and hear our continued conversation in Substack. If you were to give one or two take-home exercises for people to put into practice in the coming years, what would they be?
Right. Well, the first thing is to look at people's argumentation and see if it makes sense. To spend the time to do that. Number one. Number two, if you're confronted with a website and you don't know whether you should trust it because you've never seen it before, don't waste your time staring at that website, because whatever it tells you is going to be something they want to sell you. Don't look at the website. Go to Google and type in a search query asking, what is this website? And see what else pops up. This is a process known as lateral reading, because you're going sideways, not deep into the website. And you can find out within seconds whether the website you're looking at is a front for whatever, the fossil fuel industry or some political organizations or whatever. And then you can make a judgment about whether or not you want to trust it.
This is sound advice to go in laterally. One that I use, because some of these websites, they look credible.
Oh,
you know, they have all the bells and whistles of, oh, this is an official organization, and it really is a front for something else or some
Exactly.
ideology that is, cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. But that's
indeed.
And there's a lot of that. Professor Lewandowsky, thanks for joining me today. I want to give our listeners your website. Again, I'm going to spell it out because it's a bit different. It is COGSCIWA.com to connect with Professor Stephan Lewandowsky. Please do so at COGSCIWA.com. You can find him on Twitter at STWORG, and that's STWORG. Thanks for joining us today on Harvesting Happiness. This is Lisa Cypers Kamen on behalf of my guest, Dr. Stephan Lewandowsky, wishing you kind thoughts, kinder words, and the kindest of actions. Until next time, remember, happiness is an inside job. Happiness is your inside job. Please go out and rock your day, and remember to be kind to one another, and don't forget to register and vote. Want to explore more sound ideas for better well-being? You can listen to part 2 of this conversation and the Good Citizens Election Season Survival Guide to Restoring Common Sense and Sanity in a Crazy World at More Mental Fitness by Harvesting Happiness on Substack and Medium. Subscribe, listen, and share hundreds of downloadable episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Connect with and follow us on most social media channels. To learn more about lifestyle management and mental fitness consulting services, please visit harvestinghappiness.com. Harvesting Happiness and More Mental Fitness are produced by Lisa Cypers Kamen, Andrea Mengele, Robin Boyd, Andrea Daly, and the excellent team at Podfly Productions, including Eric Begay, Kimberly Beck, and Alec Guess, in collaboration with TogiNet Radio, KBUU, RadioMalibu.net, and is available on PRX, the Public Radio Exchange.